feeling bullied by the world these days, needing a way to fight back. Just in time for episode 17 of Pop Art, the podcast where my guest chooses a movie from popular culture, and I'll select a film from the more art classic side of cinema with a connection to it. I am your wax on, wax off, wax on, wax off host, Howard Kasner. For my listeners, please like, follow, or comment. I'm especially looking for more reviews on iTunes, and I'd love to know what you think. Today, my guest is blogger and film enthusiast Todd Liebenow, who has chosen John G. Alfredson's coming-of-age martial arts classic, The Karate Kid, while I have chosen Swedish filmmaker Tomas Alfredson's moody, atmospheric new take on vampire films, Let the Right One In, both with characters who are suffering high school angst because of bullying. To begin, Todd, why don't you tell us something about yourself?
Well, thanks, Howard. It's great to be on the show. As you said, I do blogging and podcasting about movies. Been doing that for a long time, mainly with my site, which is called Forgotten Films, and my podcast, The Forgotten Filmcast. I also have another podcast that's about Disney movies that's called Walt Sent Me. I just love watching movies and talking to other people about movies, living out here in Colorado and getting to enjoy the great surroundings here and then enjoy movies from time to time.
Great. With that, let's get to your selection, The Karate Kid. First, some information about the film. The Karate Kid was released in 1984. It was directed by John G. Alfredson and written by Robert Mark Kamen. It stars Ralph Macchio, Pat Morita, Elizabeth Shue, Martin Kove, Randy Heller, William Zabka, Chad McQueen, Ron Thomas, Rob Garrison, and Tony O'Dell. The basic premise revolves around a teenager who moves from Newark, New Jersey with his mother to the beach town of Reseda, California. After attracting the attention of a classmate that is above his social status, he is targeted for bullying by her ex-boyfriend, a karate expert. The teen's only hope is to learn karate from the apartment handyman, an expert of Okinawan descent. It all leads up to a major tournament confrontation. Why did you choose this film?
Well, 1984 is my favorite movie year. It's the year that I often say made me a movie fan. Before that, my background with movies was basically watching Disney films, Star Wars, and the yearly showing of The Wizard of Oz. Then when 1984 rolled around, there was no more Star Wars movies, and Hollywood unleashed this year that had so many great iconic movies of the 80s. And as a teenager myself that's where I really started to take an interest in movies. And The Karate Kid was one of the big movies of that year. I think it was like the number 4 at the box office. So it was definitely a big part of pop culture for a kid my age. Though I don't think I actually saw it until several months later when it first debuted on cable TV. And it's one that was a cable TV staple throughout my youth and kept returning to it over and over again. And having seen it just show up on Netflix, I was like, wow, I haven't watched The Karate Kid in forever. It seemed like a good one to revisit.
That was really nice that I didn't have to rent the film.
Yeah.
So what did you think about the film when you first saw it?
When I first saw it, I admit I wasn't that excited to see it initially. I think part of the reason I didn't see it in theaters was because I wasn't really that into the basic premise of karate. And like I say, I think the first time I saw it was on cable. I remember visiting a friend's house, a friend who was a girl and same age as me, and she was like, we're watching The Karate Kid tonight. And that was because she had a huge crush on Ralph Macchio. And so then I watched it and I was like, this is a really nice movie. It just kind of hits a lot of the things that a teenager is going to enjoy. And it's a great story about youth. You can kind of relate to the things that Daniel is going through. I really appreciate the aspect of the film where it's a connection between a young person and an older person and that friendship that developed. There's a lot more to it than just the karate training aspect of it. It's really the blossoming of this friendship and the way they come to an understanding across the years there. So I think those are the things that continue to resonate with me about this film.
What did you think of it upon seeing it again?
I think it holds up really well. Again, I think the things that resonate with me even more now, I can look at it and go, okay, I enjoy these bits of 80s nostalgia for me. You know, I love the training sequences and the music video aspect of some parts of this film where you have the little montages in the arcade, things like that, or the tournament montage. Things that jump out at me more now, especially as an adult, is seeing those tender moments, the moments of connection between the teenage boy and the older man, watching them come to understand each other and appreciation of the experience of the older man. I think one of the moments that just really grabbed me this time watching it is the sequence where Daniel realizes some of Miyagi's backstory and the pain that he has gone through as having been a soldier during World War II, and his wife and son dying during childbirth while he was away. In fact, his wife and son dying in an internment camp while he's off fighting for U.S. forces in the war. Those are things that were totally lost on me as a young person watching the movie, but just really have this more resonance now watching it as an adult. So I think it's a movie that works well for the young viewers, but it takes on all kinds of different meaning and resonance now as an older person myself.
As far as I can remember, this must be one of the earliest films that ever talked about Manzanar. It probably wasn't the only one. I think there were a couple of other movies.
As a young person watching it myself, I could see that there was some pain and some issue that Miyagi was going through there, but I did not have a deeper understanding of what that was all about. So it was almost completely lost on me watching this as like a 14, 15-year-old.
It reminds me of a couple of movies from the 40s. One is Mr. Skeffington, where the title character returns after World War II and says he was in a concentration camp because he was Jewish. And also The Stranger, which was the first film to ever actually show footage of the concentration camps in a movie. And I thought it was very interesting that in both cases, they sort of just refer to them as part of a bigger story. I often wonder what people reacted to when they saw it. Did they go, what is Manzanar? What is a concentration camp? What are these things that we're seeing? But it is something that does bring depth to Pat Morita character. I have to be honest and say this is the first time I've seen the film.
Oh, wow.
You're the second person who chose a film that I had not seen. The reason why I didn't see it when it came out, because I remember when it came out, was that I knew that it was going to be formula. I knew that it was basically Rocky set in a background of a teenager with karate instead of a boxing ring. At that time,
with the same director.
And when they asked the writer to write it, they said they want something like Rocky. So there really wasn't any pretense. Rocky started a trope. It was a very important trope. It was about the underdog. Yeah. I can't say winning because in that movie and Bad News Bears, they won by losing, though in The Karate Kid, he wins by winning. I wasn't that excited to see it. I did sort of want to see it because of Pat Morita. I somehow got the feeling that he probably was going to be the best thing about it. I was rebelling against those kind of films. I did enjoy the film very much. I do have to admit, I think it is very formulaic. I always knew what was coming. There really weren't any surprises. But it's a very enjoyable film. And for many people, I think in some ways it was a very, as you say, iconic, even important film. It said something to them when they were that age. I can recognize why people loved it so much. And it was a huge hit. It was a huge, huge hit. What are some of your favorite scenes from the movie?
I mean, I already mentioned the scene where we have that moment where we talk about Miyagi's history. I would say that's more of a favorite scene for me now. As a young person watching this film, the moments that stand out are, of course, the training sequences, which are probably the most iconic thing about this film. You even mentioned it during the intro, wax on, wax off. That's been parodied many times, and this is the thing that many people remember from this movie. There's something that's fun about training sequences in movies. I mean, you already referenced Rocky, and that's a big part of that movie, where we see these moments, we see the skills developing in the young person, the underdog. One of the things I think is so great about the way this movie does it is that it takes these run-of-the-mill things like painting the fence, waxing the car, turns them into these moments of great learning and training. So I love those training moments, and then specifically the moment where Daniel finally comes to the realization that this week that he's been spending doing all these household chores for Miyagi has actually taught him all these great things about how to defend himself, how to do the karate, and he didn't even realize it. I think those are probably some of my favorite moments.
I did think that was one of the cleverest moments on the part of Miyagi. I'm going, oh, great. Not only are you teaching him how to do everything, you're getting a ton of free labor.
Yeah.
You're getting everything done for free. So let me think, did you really choose these exercises just to help him become a better karate player? Or did you go, what chores do I happen to have lying around the house that I can turn into training so I can get all this stuff done that I haven't been able to get done for years?
No, in the end, he ends up giving him one of the cars that he did the work on there. So I guess that's a pretty good trade-off there as well. You learn how to fight and you get a car. That's not too shabby there.
I did wonder, though, how he managed to have all those cars, had that magnificent house, all on the wages of a handyman at a very poor apartment complex.
Yes. Yeah. That whole aspect of things, too, I've wondered about over the years. And I know you're in California. Maybe you have a bit more knowledge of the kind of class dynamics of that region. But I mean, they really try to play up where Daniel is, where Miyagi is the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. Whereas the girlfriend, played by Elizabeth Shue, and the bully, played by ultimate 80s bully William Zabka, the haves live this more privileged life. But yeah, Miyagi's got a good thing going on the side there. He's got quite a little complex that nobody seems to know about.
It's sort of like Friends in New York. How did they afford these incredibly large 2-bedroom apartments? Certainly the Manzanar scene about his wife and children, I think, is probably the highlight. I think almost any scene with Pat Morita in it is the highlight. I think in many ways I don't want to use the word saves the movie, but he's the heart of the movie. Without him, I just can't imagine this film working.
It's quite a revelation when that happened, because Pat Morita was known for being Arnold on Happy Days at the time that this movie came out. And suddenly he does this movie and he gets an Academy Award nomination out of it. It's a really interesting performance. He's got the tough love thing going on at times. It's very sweet and heartfelt at other times. Yeah, I really enjoy him, and I do think he's the highlight of the film. He's just got great moments with Ralph Macchio. I love the sequence where he is confronting Martin Kove when they have the whole challenge of the tournament thing going on in the dojo of the Cobra Kai, the evil karate guys. I think there's just a great dynamic going on between Pat Morita and Martin Kove in that sequence.
He was not the first choice, Pat Morita. As I understand it, the author, Carmen, wanted him for the role, but Columbia, who produced the movie, wanted Toshiro Mifune.
Oh, that would have been wild.
That would have been great. But he couldn't speak a word of English. And they didn't want Pat Morita because, you're right, he was known as Arnold on Happy Days, and he was a stand-up comedian. What he did was he grew a beard, and he dropped his American accent and used the accent, I think, of his grandfather. And after a few auditions, finally, he got the part, and he steals the movie and gets the Oscar nomination. For some reason, I knew, even though I hadn't seen the movie, they said, oh, Pat Morita is going to get an Oscar nomination.
A unique year. I was looking at some stuff about the Oscars recently, I think even before we settled on talking about this movie. 2 Asians nominated that year, one of them the winner.
Hangnor
won for The Killing. Yeah, 1984 had some unique representation going on there.
Still, Asians are one of the ones that are most underrepresented when it comes to Oscar nominations, and probably Hispanics are next in line, and there's more and more talk about that now when it comes to Oscar nominations. I enjoyed very much the scenes at the Cobra Kai. They go in, he goes in, and I'm going, this guy is psychotic.
Yeah.
This guy is just really almost an exaggeration or a satire of Steven Seagal.
I could see Seagal in that role. I think Seagal didn't really hit his peak until a few years later, but I was thinking about it when I was rewatching a few days ago, and I was going, I always think about William Zabka, the blonde-haired guy that plays Johnny, who's the main school rival of Daniel. I always think of him as being the villain, but I'm going, no, Zabka's just Darth Vader, but Martin Kove is the Emperor.
Right.
He's the one pulling the string.
Very, very different.
Related to the mother, though, I will say that one of the aspects of this film that I do have a little bit of a problem with is that the mother kind of disappears during the second half of the film, and is such a strong dynamic between her and Daniel in the early part of the film. I mean, she is legitimately concerned that he's being picked on and having trouble adjusting to their new surroundings and all that kind of stuff. And then once Miyagi enters the picture, the mother really takes a back seat. I get it. The movie's more about the relationship between the young boy and the old man, but I think the mother still could have put in a few more appearances to make it a little bit more believable.
What I thought was unusual is that on his birthday, he says he has to leave because he has to do something with his mother, and I'm going, why don't you invite Mr. Miyagi to this birthday thing? And we don't see the birthday thing, I don't think. But I agree with you. Not only did she disappear when we got to the tournament, I actually kept looking for her and saying, why isn't she at the tournament? And it took me a long time to finally say, oh, there she is.
They show her arriving during the musical montage of the different fights, but if you blink, you'll miss it.
Whenever you say montage, I keep thinking of South Park, where they had this scene where you got to have a montage song when someone's training for a ski competition.
Well, this is the 80s. You've got at least 2, maybe 3 montages in this movie. I mean, that was a requirement. If you want a hit movie in the 80s, you got to have a couple of montages.
It's very convenient. What else are you going to do?
Yeah.
But it does bring up an interesting topic, because both of these films that we are talking about do have bullying at its core. What do you think think about how this addresses the situation or what it has to say about bullying?
It's interesting because I can certainly relate to certain aspects of this. I was never the most popular kid in school. I certainly had my fair share of bullying moments. I was never like Daniel in terms of having the guts to even attempt to fight back. I mean, even before he starts training with Miyagi, he's fighting back. And he's also doing things that don't make his situation any easier. A whole bit with the Halloween party where he sticks the hose in the bathroom stall to spray William Zabka. On the one hand, I'm going, yeah, you get him there, Daniel. And on the other hand, I'm going, man, you're asking for it. I wouldn't have done that. Right. The bullying aspect of this movie is certainly something that resonated with me as a young person. It's something where you have a certain level of enjoyment, not just seeing the bad guys get theirs, but seeing this young person rise above it. And that whole theme of, well, the reason that I'm learning to fight is so I don't have to fight. I think that's an interesting concept here. It's not just, okay, he's going to learn how to fight and then punch William Zabka's lights out. No, he's learning that so he can hold his head up high and have some respect and hopefully not have to fight.
One of the interesting scenes for me when it came to bullying was when the mother said violence never solved anything. And I'm going, well, nonviolence and such never really solved anything either. It's always a combination of nonviolence and violence and not doing anything at all.
Right.
And that's often the parents' reaction is to their child has to work it out themselves. They just have to stand up for themselves, but we're not going to give them any help. We're not going to go to the institution. We're not going to go to school and say, you have a serious, serious problem here.
Well, yeah, that is one of the areas where this film is not terribly realistic. I think even in the 80s setting, the teachers, the school administration are completely oblivious and absent to any of this stuff that's going on. You've got moments of violence in here that are pretty serious on the bullying scale. It's not just a matter of stealing his lunch money or something like that. You've got serious injury happening here that you would think any school administrator worth their salt would do something about.
One of the things, though, is I wondered how you thought about the ending, because I'm not convinced that the ending resolves the situation. It resolves the Karate Kid's situation. He's going to be left alone. But you still have these psychotic, I mean, these kids are more than bullies. They're almost psychotic. They're sexual harassers. They're dangerous. They have this look in their eye that goes way beyond just feeling superior or that other people are beneath them. They almost are as psychotic as their teacher at the Cobra Kai. And they're still that way at the end. He may have given him the trophy and said, well, now I respect you, but I'm going, I don't want your respect. I want you to stop being a bully.
And I suppose some of those are questions for the sequels, of course, because there are sequels. It's been a long time since I watched the sequels, but I know they do kind of hit on a few things that followed with the Cobra Kai and whatnot. But the ending kind of wraps up a little too easily. I was always a little bit not buying it that William Zabka's character comes over with the trophy and says, "You're okay, LaRusso." You know, it's like, nah, I don't buy that. But along that same theme, there is that moment where Miyagi says something along the lines of, there's no such thing as a bad student. It's a bad teacher. Ultimately, the problem here is that these youngsters, the Cobra Kai, have been led down the wrong path by their psychotic teacher.
The other thing that I thought was interesting in relation to this was also similar to, in a way, to the mother's reaction to what is going on. And that is the scene at the country club when William Zabka forcibly kisses the heroine and she slaps him. And her parents, all their sympathy is with Zabka.
And not only that, part of that is Daniel runs into a waiter and gets spaghetti all over his shirt. And all these people, all these rich folks start cackling and laughing at this poor kid to have a little accident. Really? Are adults that cruel sometimes?
It's hard to say, but yeah, I think you have a very good point there. It doesn't resolve the social class issues either, because her parents still look down on him and still don't think he's worthwhile. And they think that this almost psychotic sexual harasser who won't leave their daughter alone is a much better boyfriend material than Ralph Macchio.
They don't care at all about the fact that Zabka's forcing kisses on Elizabeth Shue. You're not going out with that boy from Reseda again, are you?
Right. Do you think the movie is more driven by the writer or the director? One of the reasons why I asked this, even though this was, I think, an Albertson project, it was actually more a Columbia Pictures project for Albertson, but they asked Robert Mark Carmen to do a Rocky-like story. He based the movie both on some events in his life. He was bullied, and he went to a karate class, and it was like the Cobra Kai, and he hated it. And he found a different kind of karate expert that was much more like Miyagi. It's also based upon a newspaper article that Columbia had about a teenager who also took karate in order to protect himself from bullies.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, I often feel like this is more of a Robert Mark Carmen picture than it is an Alfredson picture.
I think you could be right about that. I mean, it's so hard to say because when I think of this, I think about Alfredson as the director and the fact that he directed Rocky, and there are so many similarities, but at the same time, there are a number of points in this movie that you can just stick a pin in and say, you know what, that's a moment that is where they are changing course from Rocky, that are the things that probably the audience, if you were to watch Rocky and be disappointed with anything, that you might say, well, this should have happened instead. The prime example, of course, is the fact that the hero wins at the end. There are other moments in this where you go, it's going on a similar course to Rocky, but it veers off into that more predictable, the audience pleasing area than Rocky does. Because Rocky has a lot of moments in it where it just doesn't quite fall into that same formula. As many similarities as this movie has with Rocky, there's a lot of differences too.
Well, I think in many ways, Rocky was sort of new. It's the same formula as The Karate Kid, but at the same time, Sid did it first. He wrote it. It was his baby. It was his project. He wrote it because he couldn't get the kinds of parts he wanted. And though it's not exactly based on something that happened to him, it's based on another fighter who I think sued to try to get some money off the film and perhaps at a point. There is a feeling in Rocky, it's a bit more downbeat. His background, Ralph Macchio's definitely living in upper, lower middle class, but Rocky is a collector for a living, and he's barely making a living. He doesn't have a lot of self-worth, and his best friend works in a meat factory. Rocky's life is really pretty miserable, but very realistic. It's a much more realistic and naturalistic portrayal.
The Karate Kid tries to, I think, establish Ralph Macchio's character as coming from the rough streets of Newark and stuff like that early on, but that's abandoned pretty quickly. He kind of rather quickly starts to think, hey, California, I'm going to be a California guy here, you know. Rocky is more downbeat in that regard. And Rocky does things first in a lot of ways, but when I think of Rocky, too, I also think, well, it's certainly drawing inspiration from those older films back in the 30s and 40s, the ones about a boxer or a wrestler or whatever who's got a kid, a rough life or whatever.
The boxers never win.
That era. Yeah.
They're all about boxers who lose or are down on their heels. They have to throw a fight, or if they don't throw a fight, the bad guys are going to come after and get them. There's a lot more truth, I think, in Rocky. I think that's one of the reasons why Rocky does work very well. This was a background and environment we hadn't seen. The one that we see in Karate Kid is, in many ways, a very middle-class California existence that the audience identified with and really liked. Kids who went to the mall, the kids who went to that kind of high school, these who had a lot of time on their hands, things of that nature. With that, here is some more information about the movie. It cost $8 million to make, and it earned $100 million at the box office. It was a big hit. I think you said it was like fourth at the box office that year, but nobody expected it to make this kind of money. It received an Oscar nomination, of course, for Pat Morita for Best Supporting Actor. It rejuvenated his career, and it helped make Ralph Macchio a star. In closing out, is there anything else you might want to add?
I guess I would say that I think it's a movie that holds up pretty well. I'm going to be looking at it with a certain degree of nostalgia because I was a teenager in the 80s. This is one of the definitive teen films of the 80s. I think it's a movie that has a lot of heart and is certainly one that's worth a look for those that have never seen it before.
It's sort of, in many ways, one of the films that is an inspiration for the nostalgia craze now in television shows like Stranger Things, even the movie It, which all seem to go back generally to that time period. There is something about that time period for a lot of people.
Speaking of nostalgia and TV series and such, they have done a follow-up TV series now, which I think was on YouTube's service, and it's now, I think, moving to Netflix here shortly. When it comes around to Netflix, I will be checking out this series called Cobra Kai, which I guess picks up the story 30 years later.
And Zabka is in that, isn't he?
Yes. Well, I think Macchio and Zabka, and I think Martin Kove has come back. There is talk that Elizabeth Shue may be coming back for the next season as well. I've been hearing very good reviews on it, so I'm excited to take a look. Speaking
of Elizabeth Shue, that does remind me, Andrew Shue, her brother, is in the film, but he's uncredited. I'm not even sure he has a line, but he does show up in the movie somewhere.
Never spotted him there.
With that, let's get to my selection, and that is Let the Right One In. First, some information about the film. It was released in 2008 and directed by Tomas Alfredson, written by John Liebenow, who also wrote the novel the film is based on. And it stars, and I'll probably get a lot of these wrong, Kara Hedebrandt, Lena Leandersson, Elif Silan, Per Ragnar, Henrik Dahl, Karen Bergqvist, Peter Karlberg, Ika Norg, and Mikael Ram. The basic premise is about a secondary schoolboy who is targeted for bullying by one of his fellow students. When a mysterious stranger and what seems to be a little girl moves in next door to him, a series of mysterious murders start taking place. Is it the little girl, and is she his only hope for being saved from the bullies? Now, I suppose we could start out by saying that there are some similarities between these films. They're both about bullying. They both are about young boys who live with their mother. Their fathers are either absent or in. The Karate Kid, is it ever mentioned where his father is?
I don't think they ever mentioned the father in that film.
In Let the Right One In, his father is just absent. He lives in the country and is apparently an alcoholic. But in other areas, of course, it is certainly very, very different. So when did you first see the film?
I first saw this film a few days ago. You had a first-time watch on The Karate Kid. This was a first-time watch for me, and I really enjoyed it.
Tell me more about what you thought about it, how you reacted to it.
Knowing the context here that we were going to be watching both of these films and discussing them, of course, the similarities were one of the things that were going to jump out at me. I'll get to that in a minute. I mean, as a horror film, which is kind of the most basic way to look at it, I thought it was a very effective piece of horror that really does some interesting things in terms of the way it presents things and the tone, the photography is breathtaking in many moments of this film. I love the stark landscape with the snow and such. But I mean, as far as the similarities to some of the themes in The Karate Kid, bullying part of this is just really hard hitting. You talked about the brutality of some of the bullying in The Karate Kid, and in this as well, there's just some really rough moments when it comes to that.
These guys are even a bit more psychotic.
Oh, yeah.
At least in The Karate Kid, we know why he's bullying this guy, because he wants his girlfriend back, and this guy is intruding on what he considers to be his territory. And Let the Right One In, they're just bullying this guy for the sake of bullying.
You never get an impression as to what this poor boy could have possibly done to offend these others. They're just, hey, he looks vulnerable, so we're going to pick on this kid. But one of the things that really stuck out with me, just like with The Karate Kid, is I think one of the strongest things about this film is the wonderful dynamic between our two lead characters and the friendship that evolves between them. As I thought about it, I went, in The Karate Kid, it's a friendship between a teenage boy and an old man. And in this film, I first thought, okay, we've got two kids, but I went, no, actually, we don't have that at all, because we have a 12-year-old boy, and then we have this girl who looks like she's 12 years old, but she says, I've been 12 for a long time. You have no idea. Is she hundreds of years old? I mean, with the whole mythology of vampires or whatnot, it could be. In a lot of ways, we have the same dynamic going on in this film, where we have a young person and an older person coming into this unique friendship. And I thought that was one of the most unique aspects of this film.
That's a very clever observation. You could also add to it is she's not a girl.
Yeah.
She's actually a boy. Apparently in the book, I think they get into it a bit more. It was a very popular novel in Sweden. The young boy was castrated. In fact, the voice of the girl is dubbed. That is not the actress's voice.
Oh, okay.
They wanted something more mature. Elif Silan is the voice of Eli, while Lena Leandersson plays the character. But it is about someone who forms a bond with someone who eventually will help them with their bullying. And in some ways has a kind of similar resolution, in that the only way to stop the bullying is to stop the bullies. Mm-hmm. Though they have a different approach. That's the way they stop the bullies. I first saw the film when it was released. There was something about it that sounded very interesting. One, it was Swedish. Second, it was a horror film, a vampire film. Usually at art houses, because I saw this at the Limley Theaters, which is one of the major art house here, I thought that was an unusual choice to have a Swedish horror film, so I thought there had to be something interesting. I went and saw it. It was very different from any other vampire horror film I had seen. I was so impressed by it. It was one of my top 10 films of the year, because it was just so different and so interesting and un-American. It was so foreign. You've commented on about a little, but what do you think generally of its style and its approach to the subject matter?
I loved the way that it definitely plays with what is familiar when it comes to the whole vampire mythology and the things that we've seen in a bunch of other movies. The way it presents it is, like you said, it's totally different than anything that we've ever seen before. It has this very quiet way of presenting things. A lot of the story unfolds in a very visual way, which is something that I always appreciate. But I thought in terms of the setting that we have here with the snow and everything just looks so cold and desolate, it just added to the mood of things. It's a very different type of approach for a horror film. It's not like gothic type of horror with thunder and lightning and dark shadows and things like this. Here, everything is white. It just makes everything look so unforgiving. It looks like a brutal landscape to be in, even if there wasn't a vampire there, you know.
Well, they did create this in Sweden.
Yeah, but that just created a very unsettling feel to this film, because you imagine yourself in this situation when you're watching a movie like this. Just thinking about not just the situations that are going on, but that environment. You're going, man, if I'm living in this town and there's bodies turning up left and right and the community people are confused and such, you would feel just so helpless. And that's just something that just came off the screen. And the whole time watching this film, you feel like you're in danger.
Yes. I think you made a very interesting observation when you said it has a very quiet approach. One of the things that struck me and a lot of people who saw it at the time when we talked about it is that it's not very obvious in the way it dramatizes things. Mm-hmm. For example, the first murder is shot at a distance, and there are two trees between the audience and the murder itself, so you don't quite see it so clearly. Mm-hmm. When she goes to the hospital and goes up the wall, you only see a brief glimpse of her in total black, and it just jumps out at you. It really unnerves you because it is so quiet, it is so reserved, it is so distant. It's not in your face.
I think that the moments that are kind of those centerpiece moments do build in their intensity too. Like I say, it starts very quiet. You see those murders from a distance. There's not a lot about it that we would think of as gruesome right off the bat. You don't see a lot of bloodshed initially, but then as the film progresses and we have those moments of shock when she's scaling up the side of the building, when we have that kind of subplot with a woman who gets bitten and starts to become a vampire herself, and then she at one point, I guess spoiler here, for bursts into flames. It's a very shocking moment. Yeah,
earlier. It's all spoilers on.
Yeah, you know, that moment is just so jarring. And then when we get to the final big conclusion moment, ultimate end of things, the tournament, so to speak, in this movie, you know, if we're going to relate it to the Karate Kid, that moment is just so brutal. The movie gradually builds in the intensity of those shock moments. That was just very effective.
And the ending is so effective because in some ways it's also very quiet as well. We don't see what Ellie does to those kids.
We see it, but we don't.
Right.
They let our imaginations wild, for sure, yeah.
And we don't hear it because we're with the central character underwater. And you only hear faint echoes of it, faint screams. And what we imagine is far worse, probably, than what we would actually see. And that is one of the things I liked about the movie. You had to fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can be much more unnerving than actually showing the horror in very explicit detail.
Yeah. With this movie, we're dealing with even younger kids than we were dealing with in our previous. And of course, much more brutal things going on. This village is just gripped with fear because of these murders that was going on. And as we're watching it, it's clear that children are in danger and such. And that also just contributes to the unsettling nature of this film.
And again, like in The Karate Kid, the adults don't do anything.
Yeah.
The teachers don't do anything about the bullying. The mother doesn't do anything about the bullying, just wants the kid to behave. Is mad at him for getting into trouble. There's really not a lot he can do. He does start taking the weight course, which I thought is a very funny scene. I'm all for him taking the weight course, but it is a little funny to see him with his very skinny arms trying to lift up almost the lightest weight possible. The only lighter weight is to have nothing on the bar and just be lifting the bar by itself.
I'm not one to talk on that. I probably wouldn't do much better, but...
You've talked about this some, but are there any other scenes that really stand out to you? I think for me, one of my favorite scenes is the woman in the hospital when she realizes what has happened to her. And she asks the doctor to open the window shades and let the sun in.
That's a shocking moment. I thought that was very effective. One of the scenes that stuck out for me is the scene where the class goes ice skating. It's the moment where the young boy at the center of the story decides that he's going to stand up to these bullies. You were saying how the adults are just completely oblivious. Whole episode unfolds. There's adults all around. The teachers are there, but they have no idea that out there on the ice, these kids are threatening this little boy, and then he goes and defends himself. That scene got several layers going on because you've got that going on while at the same time there's children that discover one of the bodies from a previous murder. The weapon, so to speak, that our young hero uses to defend himself was used earlier in the film by our murderer to push a body into the river. And the way that all that just came around just made it an interesting, intense sequence I really enjoyed.
It was very different when it came out. We don't usually see foreign films that are genre foreign films, at least from Europe. South Korea, all the South Korean films we get over here are somehow genre related, but most foreign films, at least from Europe, generally aren't genre related, and this was very different. We don't think about these countries doing horror films, but they do them all the time. We just don't happen to get them over here. It's probably one of the reasons why this got distribution was it was a vampire film. It was very different, and it was winning awards in Sweden. They were going to hold up distribution for it, but Sweden decided to choose, I think, the film Everlasting Moments as Sweden's entry in the foreign film category. So then they went ahead and released Let the Right One In.
See, I was curious about that because I didn't remember this coming up in the conversation with the Oscars, but I was going, man, this would have been an interesting thing to see come up in that category because, yeah, like you say, it's a genre film. It's a horror movie, and I'm struggling to think if there has been another horror film in that best foreign language film category before.
Yes, it's certainly not very often. I don't think even a Korean film that has been horror but has been the South Korean entry. You usually try to get prestige pictures. I mean, you always want the one that you think is going to win. You don't always necessarily get the one that's the best. And that can backfire on you because sometimes the one that you think is going to win is often less interesting and it doesn't get nominated anyway. In closing out, is there anything else you might want to add about the movie or about both movies?
I was just really glad for the opportunity to see this one. It's one that I had on my list for a while but had never gotten around to. I had heard a lot of good things about it. But I mean, I think this is a really interesting take on just the whole vampire mythology. It hits on things that are familiar about that, but it's totally different. And I like the way that it displays the various aspects of the whole vampire legend stuff. Another scene that I really enjoy too is that sequence where it's kind of the explanation of the title. You know, the idea that the vampire needs to be invited in. And the little boy asks her, well, what happens if you come in and I don't invite you? What difference does it make? Type of thing. And she comes in and we see what happens to her and the pain in that. And he's like, no, it's okay. You could come in. I invite you in. I thought that's something I haven't seen before in a vampire flick. I thought that was really interesting.
That was a very good scene. For some reason, it reminds me of What They Do in the Shadows in the movie, where the vampires can't get into bars.
Yes.
Because you have to be invited into the bars, and they're not cool enough to be invited into the bars, so they never get to go.
They're not on the list.
Until they make friends with the non-vampire. Their friend is so cool that he gets invited into the bar, so if he gets invited into the bars, then they get invited in.
That's such a wonderful movie. I watched that one with my kids a few months ago. My kids are both adults, but I was like, you guys need to see this movie. I really wanted to do with them what I did when I had them watch This Is Spinal Tap. I put on This Is Spinal Tap and I said, we're going to watch this movie. It's a documentary about a rock band. I didn't tell them it was fake. And then, at the end, I told them they were mad at me. I didn't think I could get away with that on What We Do in the Shadows.
Did they like it?
Oh, yes, they enjoyed it.
It's hard not to. It's just so clever and so very, very funny. Probably one of my top 5 vampire films along with this one. The director did go on to direct Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which was also rather well directed, had a very nice visual style, and that also looked very interesting. And it was also rather bleak as well.
I was curious. I know this one had an American remake. I'm now very curious as to how's that going to work, because I'm not so sure an American studio is going to allow them the same approach that this version had.
I did not see the remake because it got terrible reviews, so I didn't even bother watching it.
Well, and it came like right on the heels. I mean, it was, a year and a half, 2 years after this one got its American release.
Well, they did ask the director to direct the American version of it, but he said, I have so many stories of my own that I want to tell. Why would I want to retell one I've already done?
Yeah, this is certainly one of those films that you watch it and you go, I wouldn't have even dreamt to remake this. What are you going to improve upon with this?
Exactly. It's so much a thing of its own. And closing out, I asked you to choose a film or two to go with your choice that might interest our audience.
I have 3 here that popped into my mind as I was thinking about The Karate Kid. 3 of the different central themes that I thought about. The first one I'll just throw out kind of jumps to my mind when it comes to the martial arts aspect and the training aspect. And that is the Shaw Brothers film, The 36th Chamber of Shaolin. I have a real soft spot for those Shaw Brothers movies, and I think The 36th Chamber is kind of the classic one when it comes to the training and the unique training methods and things like that. So I think that most likely did serve as a little bit of an inspiration when it came to The Karate Kid. Then I was also thinking about the bullying aspect of things. When I think about bullying in movies, one of my favorite films from the 80s, and it's actually the first film I ever talked about on my podcast, The Forgotten Forgotten Filmcast. It's a movie called 3 O'Clock High, which is about a guy who ends up unwittingly offending the new bully at the high school, and he gets challenged to a fight after school, and he ends up spending the whole day trying to get out of the fight. It's a very underappreciated film from the 80s, from that whole teen genre that was so popular back then. So that's one I will never miss an opportunity to recommend. Then the last one that came to mind, I was thinking about the dynamic between an older person and a younger person, that type of relationship, which brought Paper Moon. Such a wonderful film with a great dynamic between an older character and a younger character on an adventure.
My choices, and I'm going to stick with the vampire aspect of my film. I'm choosing Thirst, which is by South Korean filmmaker Chan-wook Park, who is also responsible for Old Boy and The Handmaiden. It revolves around a priest who is nursing people during a plague, and through a failed medical experiment where he gets a blood transfusion from a vampire and becomes a vampire himself. He then becomes romantically involved with a childhood friend who is being abused by her husband and stepmother and agrees to help kill the husband. One of the oddest things about the film, it is based, of all things, on Émile Zola's 1800s classic French novel, Therese Raquin. I will never understand how someone read Therese Raquin and said, you know what, I'm going to make a vampire film out of this book. But it works. It was one of my favorite films of that year. And I'm a huge fan of South Korean films.
I've heard of this one. I haven't ever seen it. South Korean horror can get pretty brutal sometimes. How is this on the brutality scale?
It can get pretty bloody and it can get pretty brutal. And there's some very scary moments. So what is next? What should we be looking for from you?
Oh, well, you can always check out my blog and my podcasts. My blog is at forgottenfilmcast.wordpress.com. I post reviews on there from time to time. And then my podcast, The Forgotten Filmcast, there's always episodes up on that. So check out iTunes or the various different podcast sources for that. My other podcast, which is called Walt Sent Me. Like I said, that's about Disney movies, but it's about Disney movies in the grand sense. So basically, anything that falls under any of the studios that Disney has owned is fair game on that podcast.
Not just Disney, but Touchstone and movies that...
Touchstone, Hollywood Pictures. We've done stuff from when they had Miramax, like that. So, yeah, it's not just cartoons.
For me, I'll go through my usual litany. I am a screenplay consultant and a screenwriter. I have a Facebook consultation page called Howard Kastner Screenwriting Consultation. I have a blog called Rantings and Ravings, where I talk about subjects related to screenwriting and movies. I have 2 books of short stories published on Amazon, The Starving Artist and Other Stories, and The 5 Corporations, One True Religion. These are sci-fi, horror, and supernatural fantasy stories. My second edition of my screenwriting book, More Rantings and Ravings of a Screenplay Reader, is available for Amazon. And I am an amateur photographer, and you can find those on Instagram. The previous podcast was with filmmaker and screenwriter A.J. Bermudez, and we covered the films Face Off and Mulholland Drive, both films about people who switch identities with another person. The next podcast will be with Drew of Drew's Movie Reviews, and we will cover Finding Nemo and The Searchers, both films about fathers searching for their abducted child. So with that, I want to thank you very much, Todd, for being a guest on my podcast.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.